So we're going to start off with Tara.
All right. Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's program celebrating LGBTQ history. My name is Tara and I'm a librarian for the Sonoma County Library. And we would like to just begin this evening with a land acknowledgement. We invite everyone to take a moment to honor these ancestral lands that we are collectively gathered upon and encourage all of us to think of ways to become better stewards of the lands we inhabit. We acknowledge that our libraries occupy the traditional homelands of the Coast Miwok, Kashaya, Southern Pomo, and Wapo tribal nations, whose descendants still live here today. We recognize the historical and ongoing violence of settler colonialism and affirm Indigenous sovereignty. We will continue to hold ourselves accountable to the needs of the Indigenous people of Sonoma County, California, and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. And hello, everyone. My name is Javier Morales. I'm also a librarian for the Sonoma County Library. Before we get started and we introduce our presenters for today's event, I'm just going to go over some quick details about how this session will work. The presentation will be recorded and be available within a few days on the library YouTube channel. We do ask that you mute your mics for the presentation. If you have questions, please wait for the end of the presentation where we will have a brief Q&A. Feel free to use the chat, but questions asked there may not be addressed. We ask that you please keep the chat respectful and kind, and we have a wonderful coworker, Betsy Boyle, who will also be helping us moderate the chat. And now I'll pass it on to Stuart.
Thank you for the reminders, Javier. Hello, everyone. My name is Stuart, and I'm a librarian for the Sonoma County Library out here at the Guerneville branch. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today's program, Tina Dugan and Chad Weinstein. All right, Tina and Chad.
I am Tina Dugan. I've been living in Sonoma County my entire life. I came out in about 1972 at Women's Studies at Sonoma State. And I've also been involved for the last 13 years or so with Lesbian Archives of Sonoma County. And Chad and I met 2017, and have been working together since then. And I teach a class through the Junior College Older Adults program called LGBTQI Timeline of Sonoma County. Chad?
So my name is Chad Weinstein. I moved to Sonoma County in about 11 years ago. And I started working with Tina because I wanted to find out what was actually going on and why there was such a huge population of LGBT people in Sonoma County. I use the pronoun, well, actually I use all of the pronouns. I normally describe myself as she. However, I have been gender nonconforming my whole life. And some people address me as he, some people address me as they. I don't care how I'm referred to as long as it's done respectfully. And at this program, what this presentation was originally, I did it as for Tina's LGBT Sonoma County history class as one of the first presentations to help set the environment for how Sonoma County developed. And then I asked Tina to help me read it today. So I want to start, and I'm going to share the screen, which is, of course, it's, let me do this and try sharing the screen again. Yes. Is that now, can you all see that now?
Yes.
Great. So I want to start by talking a little bit about language during the period of time we're going to talk about. Homosexual and homophile were the medical or official words that were used to describe both gay men and lesbians in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and even the 60s. Gays and lesbians were the words that some people might use to identify themselves, but many people would never even use those terms at all. Transgender people were usually called drag queens or transsexuals. The word queer was not used by lesbians or gays. Queer was usually used to harass gay men, especially when they were being beaten up. To understand the 1950s and 60s of San Francisco LGBT culture, first you have to go back and look at what was happening in San Francisco in the 1930s. San Francisco was known as a, quote, bohemian city, unquote. And San Francisco actively encouraged what was called sex and race tourism. Both Finocchios and Monas advertised in the 1937 program for this that celebrated the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge as bars and places that would have different presentations. Finocchio's originally was a restaurant. In 1936, to survive the Depression, the straight couple who owned Finocchio's transformed it into a night spot where, quote, men performed as female impersonators. A 1939 guidebook described Finocchio performers as wigged, gowned, rouged, lipstick, and mascaraed. 10 beautiful boys became singing, clowning, ravishing women in a review of reviews. It's different, unquote. And most of the people who were there were tourists. Men could meet each other at Finocchio's by going through a very discreet and orchestrated process. It was overseen by the maitre d'. Quote, if you wanted to meet a young man who was sitting at another table, you had the waiter take a bottle of wine and a glass on a little tray and with your card, and he carried it from you to the other man's table. If a connection was made, the maitre d' would then invite both men to sit at the same table and make a formal introduction. Mona's Barrel Club was the first and only lesbian-oriented bar in San Francisco and until after World War II. Mona Nystrom Sargent, that was the name of her first husband, was born in Guerneville in 1910. When her husband, Jimmy Sargent, decided to open a bar, his friends told him he should call it Mona's rather than Jimmy's. They decided to imitate Finocchio's and opened a club where, quote, girls will be boys, unquote. The walls at Mona's were decorated with murals of naked and slightly tart women. Lesbians came in to see the waitresses who were dressed in tuxedos and performed on the stage. Mona said her club was 1/3 gay, 1/3 our regular bohemian crowd, and 1/3 tourists. Same-sex physical affection was illegal, so there was definitely no dancing. But if you were discreet, you could hold hands with someone under the table. Mona said in the 1930s that she didn't know about lesbians, only that lesbians were called lady lovers. Later, she told someone that she felt it was so important that women at her club got to be who they really were and that they deserved a place like Mona's. Charlotte Coleman, who we will talk about later, recalled, everybody liked Mona. She was straight, but she was really good. If any police came in, she would do anything for you. She would stop them at the door and say, you don't touch my women. She was really sweet, but she was also really tough when it came to us. She wouldn't let anybody bother anybody.
Social networks for gay men began developing in World War II. Every man in the US had to go through a draft process to join the military that included being asked questions about being gay. 18 million men were drafted into the Army, but about 4,000 to 5,000 men were rejected entry into the military because they were homosexual. Signs of being gay included just having a flip of the hand. Gay men from farms and small towns might have previously known one or two other people in their small communities who they thought might be gay. Then they were put into barracks where only men lived. The bathrooms had no privacy, so everyone had to see each other's penises. Lots of men began experimenting with gay sex. San Francisco grew dramatically during World War II. It was frequently the last spot men would visit before being shipped to the Pacific battlefront and their unknown fate. Servicemen would hitchhike from their base into the city to the Tenderloin, where they could find everything they needed: lockers where they could leave their uniforms and rent civilian clothes, tattoo parlors, sex theaters, tailors, cafeterias, bathhouses, gay prostitutes, straight brothels, and cheap hotels. Anytime military men were stationed in a new city, they would be handed a list of bars and areas of the city to avoid. This list would include gay bars, making them very easy to find. Some of the gay San Francisco bars in the 1940s include Blanco's, the Artist Club, the Candlelight, the Paper Doll, and Chi Chi.
Okay, let's try that.
Women could join the military in either the WACs or the Women's Army Corps, or the WAFs, Women's Air Force. Masculinity did not stop women from serving in the WACs or the WAFs. In the same way, effeminate men were disqualified from the army. Many butch lesbians joined up. Many gays and lesbians served in the military in glass closets, where they did not totally hide their lives and relationships, but they were not totally out. Many other gays and lesbians were discharged from the military for homosexual activity. Whether the military was actually going to discharge you depended on two things. Were there enough troops in your geographic area to fight the war? And what was the attitude of your officers about gay men? People who were discharged received a blue discharge, which was officially called an undesirable discharge. It was kind of a middle ground between honorable and dishonorable discharge. Blue discharges ruined many lives. They were often marked HS or some other code for homosexual, effectively disqualifying the veteran from receiving any GI rights or benefits. It also barred many discharged soldiers from getting civilian jobs. Blue discharges were also used to get rid of Black soldiers in the army. Anyone who received a blue discharge while serving anywhere in the Pacific area would be discharged in San Francisco. Many of these gay men did not want to go back to the small towns and farms because they were embarrassed by a blue discharge. Others, after they had been in the service, did not want to live in the small towns anymore. So San Francisco got a small but constant influx of gay men and a few lesbians to the city. By the end of World War II, a lot of gay men settled in San Francisco. The Tenderloin and the Polk Gulch at the edge of the Tenderloin were the first gay spaces in the city. Businesses catering to gay men were flourishing there. By the 1960s, the Tenderloin was also home to a lot of transgender individuals and queer youth. In June 1964, Life magazine published an article, quote, "Gay San Francisco," in which they said that San Francisco was the gay capital of America. North Beach was another area in the city where gays and lesbians settled. It was not until the 70s that the Castro became the center for gay men.
The Black Cat Cafe opened in 1933. During World War II, it was on the list of the bars servicemen could not go to. In 1948, the police began to harass the Black Cat and it lost its liquor license. The straight owner, Saul Stroman, sued the state in order to get his liquor license back. In 1951, he won. The California Supreme Court ruled that, quote, "something else must be shown besides the fact that many of his patrons were homosexual and that they used his restaurant and a bar as a meeting place," unquote, to lose their liquor license. But bars could still lose their license with, quote, "proof of a commission of illegal or immoral acts happening on the premises," unquote. From 1951 to 1955, there was a brief period where gay bars flourished in San Francisco. That brief period ended with a raid on Tommy's Place. In June of 1952, lesbian entrepreneur Tommy Vasso opened two bars, Tommy's Place and 12 Alder Place, which were connected by a mezzanine and a stairway. Even though Vassaux had her name on one of the bars, she wasn't the owner. Her girlfriend, Jean Sullivan, owned 94% of the liquor license, and the bartenders, Grace Miller and Joyce Vanderveer, owned the rest. At that time, women weren't allowed to tend bar in San Francisco unless they were the owners. This was the only lesbian bar in San Francisco which was both owned and operated by lesbians. The parents of two teenage girls complained to the police that their daughters were frequenting a gay bar and buying drugs there. The police said the teenagers recruited other classmates to join them at the bars. Some of the girls began wearing mannish clothing and called themselves butches and femmes. On September 8th, 1954, Tommy's place was raided. Grace Miller and Joyce Vanderveer, the two bartender owners, were arrested. Joyce was acquitted. Grace was convicted of selling alcohol to a minor. A man was convicted of selling drugs to the girls. The bars closed and Tommy ended up running a nearby parking lot. After this raid and the publicity around it, the police harassment of gay bars increased again.
Jose Saria was the best known drag queen in the Bay Area in the 1950s and 60s. He was also a political activist, helping to found three of the most important gay organizations in San Francisco in the 1960s. They were the Tavern Guild, the Imperial Court System, and the Society for Individual Rights. Jose served in the army in Italy during World War II. During a battle, he would fight and fire guns, but usually he was an aide to the commanding colonel. Jose's job was to take care of the colonel and other officers. After the war, he ran an officers' club in Berlin where he would frequently have to take the officers' wives shopping. His boyfriend was the costume designer for the Berlin Opera. In the 1950s, he returned to the US and went to college in San Francisco to become a teacher. But after he was arrested for being gay, he realized he could never become a school teacher, so he decided to be gay all of the time. Jose Sario was known as the Nightingale of Montgomery Street. He performed at the Black Cat Cafe and wrote and performed gay versions of operas, especially Carmen. They were filled with sexual innuendos as well as political and/or social commentary. Jose encouraged patrons to be as open and honest as possible, exhorting the clientele, quote, "There's nothing wrong with being gay. The crime is getting caught," unquote. And united we stand, divided they catch us one by one. At closing time, he would lead patrons in singing, "God Save Us, Nellie Queens." Sometimes he would take the crowd outside to sing the final verse to the men across the street in jail who had just been arrested in raids earlier that evening. In San Francisco, if you were a drag queen, you would be arrested for, quote, "impersonating a woman," unquote. Jose would hand out handmade paper labels to his fellow drag queens to wear that said, quote, "I am a boy," unquote. It prevented the police from arresting them for intent to deceive. Undercover policemen also had to answer truthfully if they were asked if they were a cop. Jose would ask someone publicly from the stage if they were a cop so everyone in the audience would know who the undercover cops were. Then Black Cat would call other bars to let them know what that night's undercover cop looked like.
Police would raid bars that the gay men and the lesbians went to. After bar raids, lists of arrestees were printed in newspapers, or the police would tell their employers. They would be subject to reprisals from all parts of society, from their employers, the police, the military, the government, their family, and their friends. They would be fired, kicked out of their homes, lose their apartments, and kept from seeing their children. Sometimes people would actually commit suicide after being arrested. The largest gay bar raid in San Francisco history occurred in August of 1961 at a late night coffee house called the Taybush Inn. Over 100 people, most of whom were women, were arrested for disorderly conduct and taken to jail. The media coverage of the Taybush raid unlike other previous raids, was somewhat sympathetic toward the men and the women who were arrested. The raid actually promoted questions about the rights of the gay men and lesbians to congregate in public.
In 1961, tired of police harassment, Jose Sario declared himself a candidate for supervisor, becoming the first out LGBT person in the world to run for an elected office. He said that he ran to prove, quote, "I had the right to run for public office, that I had the right that anybody else had. The fact that I was gay did not restrict me. I was not a second-rate citizen," unquote. People were afraid to sign his nomination petition. He blackmailed people to sign it, saying he would out them if they didn't sign his nomination petition. He had to borrow a suit jacket to wear for his campaign picture. Not shown in that picture, below the waist was a skirt. Jose ran his campaign from the Black Cat Bar and made many speeches to the gay community about accepting the power if they worked together. To prevent him from possibly winning, the city bosses packed the ballot with 34 candidates at the last minute. Zaria still came in fifth, winning 6,000 votes. In 1962, after this Tay-Bush Inn raid and the closing of several gay bars, bar owners formed a tavern guild. It was the first gay business association in the United States. One of the first things they did was to formalize the phone networking system that warned bars that they were about to be raided. They also circulated pictures of undercover officers, as well as the names of patrons who wrote bad checks. They fixed drinks prices so that bars wouldn't compete with each other. They also set up a fund for unemployed bartenders and guild members. At least 2 musicians from Guerneville received that kind of support. When a bar was going to close, the Tavern Guild would send Jose to perform there so the bar would have a profitable last few weekends.
The Tavern Guild organized many events to raise money for many different organizations, including SIR, the Society for Individual Rights, the Mattachine Society, and the Daughters of Bellitus, as well as for straight civil rights organizations. One of the most important events the Tavern Guild sponsored was the annual Halloween drag ball, known as the Beaux Arts Ball. It began in 1963. It was San Francisco's first large public drag ball. The first ball was held at a hotel in Chinatown that had a new thing. It had an escalator. Some of the drag queens had never been on an escalator before, and they got their gowns caught in the escalator. People at a Chinese wedding in another ballroom in the hotel came over to see what the commotion was. Then they started watching the drag queens and the ball rather than watching their own wedding celebration. In 1968, 2 Sonoma County bars, Aldo's in Guerneville and the Monkey Pod in Santa Rosa, sold tickets to the Beaux Art Ball. Each summer, the Tavern Guild would hold a picnic, but it was never held in the same place 2 years in a row because of, quote, complaints about the picnic. In 1964, the Tavern Guild held a summer picnic someplace on the Russian River. The last summer picnic the Guild held was in 1971, also in Guerneville, and probably at Aldo's. 7 men were arrested that afternoon for public sex. In 1964, when Jose Sario was crowned queen of the Tavern Guild Beaux Arts Ball, Jose proclaimed, "We're all queens, and why become a queen when you can become an empress?" She declared himself Her Royal Majesty, Empress of San Francisco, Jose I, the widow of Joshua Norton. Now, Joshua Norton had lived in San Francisco back in the 1850s. In 1859, after losing his business and fortune, he became increasingly eccentric and declared himself Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. He printed his own money, issued proclamations and decrees, and outlandishly called for building a bridge and a tunnel across the bay to Oakland. Jose turned his followers into a royal court, which he ran as the Empress. In 1965, by the time Jose completed her year as the Empress, he had established himself as a leader of the fun and dedicated group of volunteers, which she called the Imperial Court of San Francisco, the ICS. Based upon European royalty, he appointed Tsarinas to oversee different areas of San Francisco, such as Polk Street, the Castro, the Tenderloin, and the Mission. Tsarinas were charged with raising money to give back to the community, as well as educating and creating a sense of gay pride, identity, and unity while having fun. In a couple of years, drag communities in other cities wanted to join the imperial court system. Jose worked with these groups to craft a loose union of nationwide chapters, always focused on pride, equality, and raising money for charitable causes. It's still in existence. Now there are over 60 chapters in 3 nations. And I very consciously sometimes called Jose he and sometimes she. That's how Jose referred to herself when we talked to him.
We now need to go back a few years to 1950. In that year, Harry Hay, a communist, formed the Mattachine Society for Gay Men in Southern California. Jerry Bissett, who was from the Bay Area, started forming local chapters in Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco. However, the Bay Area chapters differed from Southern California because here the Mattachine Society included a large number of women members. Jerry Bissett said gay men and lesbians in the Bay Area, quote, flocked to us in hordes, hungry, anxious, and eager to do something, to say something, and get started, unquote. In 1953, there was a split over the issues of radical politics and communism. Harry Hay and his communist friends left. The Mattachine Society then started focusing on working with professionals who were studying homosexuality. In October of 1954, 7 members in San Francisco opened the country's first gay press, the Pangraphic Press. In February of 1955, they started printing their official newsletter, the Mattachine Review. Pangraphic Press also printed other newsletters and eventually printed and distributed gay books. By 1957, San Francisco had become the national headquarters of the Mattachine Society, and it's not quite clear exactly when they closed.
Okay, now let's talk about lesbians for a few minutes. Ricky Stryker, who owned the Vauqueray in Guerneville, Maud's and Amelia's in San Francisco, described lesbian culture in the 1950s and 60s as being differentiated by class and by roles. For instance, you were either butch femme or industrial class or dykes. They were all the same for the same type of person. In her opinion, and using her description, quote, dykes were a lower class and they were into emulating male roles. She said they would treat their partners the way a man would treat a woman and try to have the same male power with that woman that men had associated with marriages. Butches, by her description, were, quote, claiming their differences. Butches wore jeans, t-shirts, sweaters, and had a DA or a duck's ass, the popular men's hairstyle. Because they were obvious, butches were frequently attacked in the streets. So being a butch meant that you were tough, and if necessary, you were willing to fight and defend your femme. Some of these people would be considered transgender now, but many of these people were not. Women who weren't either butch or femme were called kaikais or ACDC. Then there were the polyester suit lesbians. They would go home with a butch for the night, but they would not be in a relationship with her. Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon are best known for starting the DOB, the Daughters of Bellitus, in 1955. It was the first lesbian organization in the United States. They also edited its newspaper, The Ladder, but their political work went far beyond DOB and the latter. Other projects they worked on during their lives include helping to form the Council on Religion and Homosexuals in 1964. That joined together the homosexual activists and Protestant church leaders. We'll talk about that in a minute. In 1966, they helped form the Citizens Alert. It was a multi-issue police response network, a number to call that responded 24 hours a day to police harassment of not only LGBT people, but people of color. In 1972, Del and Phyllis published the groundbreaking book, Lesbian Woman, which is considered the basis of lesbian feminism. The next year, they published Lesbian Love and Liberation. In 1979, Martin wrote Battered Wives, one of the first books to deal with physical abuse of women by their husbands, and she helped form the first battered women's shelter in San Francisco. Their research on legal issues in child custody cases of lesbian mothers helped form the National Center for Lesbian Rights. They were also chosen to be the first couple to be legally married in California in the 20 few years ago. Del and Phyllis met when they were both working on an engineering magazine in Seattle in 1950. They became lovers in 1952 and moved to San Francisco on Valentine's Day in 1953. Del Martin had been married and had a daughter whose name was Kendra. Del and Phyllis recalled how they learned to live together in 1953, saying, "We really only had problems our first year together. Del would leave her shoes in the middle of the room and I'd throw them out the window," said Lyon. To which Del Martin responded, "You'd have an argument with me and try to storm out the door, and I had to teach you to fight back."
The Daughters of Bellitus, or the DOB, was founded in 1955. It was the first lesbian civil and political rights organization. Through their newsletter, The Ladder, they brought hundreds of lesbians into communication with other lesbians, allowing them to share their everyday struggles. DOB was started by 8 women and 4 couples. 4 were blue collar and 4 were white collar workers. 2 were lesbian mothers and 2 were women of color. They wanted a safe place to meet and dance where they didn't have to be afraid of police raids. The Daughters of Bellitus was named after the Songs of Bellitus, which was a poetry collection from 1894. It was supposed to have been written by a contemporary of the ancient Greek lesbian poet Sappho, who had lived on the island of Lesbos. In reality, it was written by a man. The DOB meetings were originally held in Del and Phyllis's living room. Their house was at the top of a hill with big windows that looked over San Francisco. They had to make sure that all of the curtains in the whole house were closed so that the neighbors wouldn't see a group of women socializing together without any men. But within a year, DOB was holding public meetings to educate the public about gays and lesbians. Because they were billed as public educational meetings, women could attend without having to publicly identify as lesbian. Del and Phyllis said they wanted to help a lesbian understand herself and to believe in her own worth and have a good self-image. The DOB had 4 goals: education of variant, education of the public, participation in research projects, and investigation of the penal code as it pertains to the homosexual. After the first year, DOB had 15 members. Some working class lesbians felt alienated by the organization's emphasis on the importance of appearing, quote, respectable and, quote, dressing appropriately, unquote. Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon apologized later for trying to make lesbians dress more respectably. In October of 1956, the tiny group of DOB members in San Francisco decided to start a newsletter to advertise their meetings and social events. They came up with the name Ladder to signal to potential readers that this publication would help lift them up. The first issue was typed and printed in November. A volunteer staff produced each issue. Someone would design the cover, Someone else would type up all the articles on a typewriter. Then it would have to be copied by a mimeograph machine, collated by hand, and finally hand stapled and taken to the post office. The latter became the first ongoing monthly magazine created by lesbians for lesbians in the United States. It was published continuously by DOB from 1956 to 1970. At its peak, the latter had 500 subscribers, more than any of the gay newsletters at that time. The content of the magazine ranged from fiction and poetry to interviews, news, and book reviews. In 1966, the latter published an article comparing lesbian and gay men's concerns. Men were worried about harassment around sex and arrests, while lesbians were concerned about job security and family child custody issues. Phyllis Lyons said, quote, "It became obvious then that the concerns that gay men had in those days had to do with tea room entrapment, also known as sex in public toilets. You know, changing the sex laws and stuff that really was all around sexual activities. And the concerns that lesbian had to do more with civil stuff, had to do with loss of jobs, had to do with children, loss of children, and dealing with child custody. Most women were afraid to use their real names, so they would make up names for the latter to be mailed to. In 1964, Ger van Braam from Indonesia was the first lesbian willing to have her face shown on the cover of the latter. Then in 1966, Ernestine Epstein, the vice president of the New York chapter, was the first Black lesbian to allow her portrait to appear on the magazine's cover.
By 1960, because the latter had DOB chapters in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City, as well as in San Francisco, they decided to have the first ever National Lesbian Convention in San Francisco. 200 lesbians attended. DOB described it as, quote, "a true convention with luncheons, speakers, and panels," unquote. There were speeches and panels by an Episcopalian minister, by lawyers, by the ACLU, and by psychiatrists. There were also talks on gay folk songs and writing and publishing lesbian novels. The police came into the luncheon to check that the DOB was not promoting or encouraging women to dress like men, unquote. Luckily, all of the women there were dressed properly in heels, stockings, and skirts. DOB started having a lesbian conference every 2 years. In 1966, the San Francisco Chronicle covered the DOB conference and had a 4-inch column headline proclaiming, "SF greets daughters." In 1968, DOB did a survey of about 150 San Francisco psychiatrists. They found that, depending on the question, between 80 and 97% of the psychiatrists supported gays and lesbians. Charlotte Coleman was a bar owner, a member of DOB, and a lesbian activist. She was the second out lesbian to open a bar in San Francisco. During World War II, she was a member of the Coast Guard. After the war, she worked as an auditor for the IRS. They fired her when they found out she was a lesbian. In 1958, she opened The Front, a bar that also served food in the city's wholesale produce area. Both female and male impersonators performed at The Front. Men who worked in the produce area would come in to have a drink and food during the day. At night, lesbians could come in safely because there was no one around to see them. During the 1960 DOB convention, Charlotte closed The Front for 1 day so that there could be a private DOB party there for the convention goers. After police raids and harassment, she lost her license and her liquor license. She and her partner, Peggy Foster, opened a gay male bar, the Golden Cask. Finally, they opened the Mint, a steakhouse and bar. They regularly held benefits for everything from SIR and to AIDS organizations. Del and Phyllis said, DOB was a good coming out place where women could get their act together and find out who they were and be able to talk to others and hash it out. We felt that people got themselves together and then they could go out and cope with the world. Phyllis added, we were trying to help lesbians find themselves, I mean, you can't have a movement if you don't have people who see that they're worthwhile.
Ricky Stryker opened the bar Mods in the mid-1960s. She felt that bars were a more supportive and diverse environment for lesbians than the DOB was. In San Francisco in the 1950s and early 60s, everyone went to the same bars. She said, quote, everyone was just out to have a good time. You would be at a bar with your bunch and you might not interact with a different bunch. So individuals would decide what they wanted to do and do it. But when something happened, everyone in the bar would get together to support one another without talking about it. Ricky felt organizations like DOB were for middle-class professional lesbians who never went to bars except in groups to feel safe. Organizations like DOB would have, quote, a commonality among the members, unquote. They were just fortifying themselves with each other and had the need to communicate with people just like themselves. She described Mods more as a free thinker and cutting edge bar than was Peg's, one of the other lesbian bars. She says that in the late 1960s, lesbians who came to Mods were into drugs and would wear jeans with holes in them. Society was changing. In September 1964, the San Franciscan Society for Individual Rights, or SIR, formed to focus on building community, public identity, and legal and social services. It sponsored drag shows, dinners, dances, and social activities such as bridge clubs, bowling leagues, art classes, and sports teams. The new organization's leaders were more assertive and confident in their gay identity and demanded equal rights and the end of discrimination. Their agenda was committed to, quote, responsible action by responsible people in responsible ways, unquote. SIR and the Tavern Guild printed and distributed Pocket Lawyers. These pocket-sized guides offered advice on what to do if arrested or harassed by the police. I know one man in Sonoma who remembers always carrying his pocket lawyer every time he went to the bars. SIR was more inclusive than other early organizations. In April of 1966, SIR opened the first gay center in the US. The gay center contained an office space, library, and an assembly area for meetings and dances. Its calendar was packed. It worked with the public health department to educate gay men about venereal disease. It published the magazine Vector. By 1968, they had over 1,000 members, making them the largest homophile organization in the country.
The Council on Religion and the Homosexual, or CRH, was founded in December 1964 for the express purpose of joining homosexual activists with religious leaders. It was founded by Del Martin, Phyllis Lyon, and the Glide Memorial Methodist Church. They were the first group to use the word homosexual in its name. The first activities that CRH did was to hold a, quote, New Year's Day Mardi Gras ball for the LGBT community at a rented hall. The police had previously agreed not to interfere or harass it. But that night, police cars and paddy wagons were parked in front of the hall, and police photographers took pictures of each of the 600 guests at the ball. When the police then demanded entry into the ball, 4 lawyers, 2 gay and 2 straight, and a ticket taker were arrested for, quote, obstructing an officer. It was the first time that straight lawyers and religious leaders had ever been exposed to the way that the police harass gays and lesbians. 2 days later, the ministers held a press conference condemning the police. ACLU lawyers, along with 25 other prominent San Francisco lawyers, took that case to trial. The judge actually ordered the jury to return a verdict in favor of the gays before those defense lawyers ever presented a word in their case. That summer, the CRH members passed out a flyer. Every 10th person is a homosexual at the California State Fair. Later in 1965, CRH held an event where local politicians could be questioned about issues concerning gay and lesbian people. That event marks the first known instance of the gay vote being sought by politicians.
Now to the Tenderloin. Since the 1940s, gay cruising and prostitution has been popular in the Tenderloin as well as in the adjacent area of Union Square. Macy's basement restroom and the area around Union Square were where downtown businessmen would go to cruise. On Polk Street, there was a bar where hustlers would sit, and the Johns would sit at tables with phones on them. The Johns would call the bar and say, "I want to meet the fifth man from the end." The area around Mason, Turk, and Market Streets was known as the meat market. Cheap hotels such as El Rosa Hotel and the Dalt, as well as the Embarcadero YMCA, offered housing for hustlers and sex workers. 3 early gay bars in the Tenderloin were the Sailor Boy Tavern, the Ensign Club, and the Gilded Cage. The Sailor Boy Tavern was known for its military clientele as well as its rough clientele. The Ensign Club was known for orgies that were open to all races of men in the basement. And the Gilded Cage was one of the top drag clubs in San Francisco. By the 1960s, more gay clubs and bathhouses were opening in the Tenderloin. We're not sure exactly when the gay male bathhouse popularity began in San Francisco, but the police in 1966 announced a crackdown on gay bathhouses, and in March of that year, raided the 21st Street baths. The Toolbox, which opened in 1962, was one of the first leather bars. It had a huge mural on its back wall of leather men painted by a bartender, Chuck Arnett, and was featured in Life magazine's article on homosexuality in America in 1964. The photographs of the Toolbox and that mural were spread across 2 pages. A second leather bar, Phoebe's, opened in 1966. Phoebe's became famous for featuring a statue by the gay artist Mike Caffey that transformed Michelangelo's David into a shirtless man in motorcycle garb. The leather David sculpture was reproduced and distributed internationally.
The Vanguard Youth Group was a group of gay and lesbian youth. Many of them were homeless, transgendered, and engaged in sex work in order to survive. It was formed in 1965 and was the first known gay youth group in the United States. It lasted for 17 months before it became a part of the Glide Church. A smaller lesbian group called Street Orphans was formed inside the Vanguard Youth Group. Their meetings were held at Compton's cafeteria. Gay youth socials or dances were held in the Glide Church basement. They also published a magazine, The Vanguard, which was written by the youth. It extolled drug culture, championed anti-war and anti-establishment politics, and demanded the right to sexual freedom and self-determination. It also used psychedelic design techniques by blending multicolored pages and inks, psychedelic art, and psychedelic lettering. Compton's cafeteria was open 24 hours a day in the Tenderloin. Many drag queens and transgendered people and street kids hung out there because they were not welcome to go into the neighborhood gay bars. In July of 1966, Compton started imposing a service charge to harass and keep street people out of their cafeteria. They would call the police if you didn't spend enough money. The Vanguard Youth Group organized a picket line to protest the service charge. No one knows the exact date of the Compton cafeteria riot, since there was no coverage in any San Francisco newspapers or any of the LGBT newsletters. In August of 1966, the police came into Compton's cafeteria to arrest people for, quote, female impersonation. A transgender woman resisted arrest by throwing coffee at the police officer. At that point, a riot began. Dishes and furniture were thrown, and the plate glass windows were smashed. Drag queens fought back with their high heels and heavy bags. A police car was destroyed, and a nearby paper stand was burned that first night. The next night, there was a picket of the cafeteria. The cafeteria now banned drag queens and transgender people. The windows, which had been replaced that day, were broken again. Vanguard Youth Group members were a major part of all of the Compton cafeteria's protests. Shortly after the riot, the Center for Special Problems was established. It provided social, psychological, and medical support for transgender people. It also gave them IDs with their chosen name on it. In 1968, the National Transsexual Counseling Unit, Ntcu, was established. It was the first peer-run support and advocacy organization for transgender people in the world.
In early autumn of 1966, Vanguard Youth Group hosted a historic street sweep in response to all of the events at Compton's Cafe. About 50 Vanguard members took to the streets of the Tenderloin with push brooms that they had borrowed from the city. They were protesting the routine practice of police sweeping the streets to remove all of the queer people and homeless youth from gay neighborhoods. They showed, quote, that gay homeless youth are not trash, unquote.
So that's it. Let's go back to Javier and see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. And yes, and now if anyone would like to ask a question, we are more than happy to take them from the crowd. You can type them if you'd like, or you can also raise your hand, whether you do that in your video or doing that with Zoom's reactions. And I'll share a quick image just showing how you can do that if you haven't done it before. So if you're accessing it on desktop, this will be a little closer to what you'll see, but it should be very similar if you're doing it on mobile. There should be a reaction button that you can then select raise hand. And then once you're done, you can lower it. I'll leave that up for a bit. But yeah, is there any questions from the crowd? Oh, Allison in the chat is asking, how widely known were these bar raids and such to the public when they happened?
Well, it would literally be announced in the paper. There would be a list of that, yes, this, such and such a bar, the Black Cat was, for example, was raided, and these were the men that were arrested, and this is where they worked and lived. So it would be really easy for their family, their bosses, everyone to know it. They weren't like first page, in the newspaper, so it wasn't like everyone knew it, but they were definitely widely reported in all of the major newspapers.
Oh wow, I didn't realize that they also listed like the job as well. That definitely seems like
yeah,
back then. Ooh. Oh, and then Magi's asking, please comment on how this info was found in your research.
Well, there is a book, which Tina, I can't remember the name of, that is the history of San Francisco. There, I have a book, a long, several hundred-page article from the city of San Francisco that documents all of the San Francisco LGBT history, but it relies heavily on the book. I had the privilege of spending a weekend with Jose Saria and interviewing him when he was living in Palm Springs. So we got to spend literally 4 or 5 hours each day with him, going out to lunch with him and getting to know him. And then there's 2 books on Del and Phyllis, or there's a book on Del and Phyllis called, oh, I never remember the exact name of it. I'm sure that Different Daughters, a history of the Daughters of Bellitus and the rise of the civil rights movement, which is by Marcia Gallo, Gallo. There's also a film by Joan Byron called No Secret Anymore, which is the history, a film on the history of Del and Phyllis and the DOB. And actually, Del and Phyllis had a house in Jenner. It's still there. It's still painted purple, the original color that Del and Phyllis had. And Kendra, their daughter, also had a house in Jenner too. So she had a relationship with this Sonoma County and the Guerneville area. Also, it's really easy to find tons of information about Del and Phyllis and Jose. And the pictures all came out of Google Images, and that most of them had originated at the LGBT History Archives in San Francisco, and then were republished by someone else and were taken to Google Images. The LGBT Archives didn't put the images on Google Images. Other people did.
Gotcha. And then also looks like Tina commented the other book is Wide Open Town by Nan Boyd. And we have a couple more questions as well. Magi also asked, are there archives for any of the people, places, events covered in this presentation?
Most of them, sometimes there are and sometimes there aren't. It's in the archives in San Francisco. You can make an appointment to go there. And they're very careful about not putting too many people in a room, and you have to say, I'm looking for information on such and such.
Gotcha. Thank you for that info. And Allison's also asking, are there any other books like Different Daughters and Wide Open Town you recommend for learning more of this history?
Tina, what would you recommend? You know, there is, if you're interested in LGBT history, Don Romsberg, who is a professor at Sonoma State, has put together a book by Rutledge, the Rutledge LGBT history book, and that is a really good academic book on LGBT history around the years and doesn't really focus on San Francisco, but is really diverse, deals with different classes, rural, urban, different races. It's a great book, and if you don't have it in the library, you definitely should get it.
That should give me a great idea. I'll make sure to compile a list with links later when we send out the recording.
There's also this, Lillian Fodderman's book, the Gay Revolution, and don't you know another one, Shad's, called Sophistries?
There's a book called Sophistry, and then there's a second Lillian Faberman book that is more, the first one that Tina has is more, I think more, that's the first one, right?
I believe so.
That's more academic. And then there's a second one that is more readable and less academic. And that is, I can't remember what the name of that is. There's also, if you're interested in the gay male Tenderloin period, Jack Fuster, who was one of the leaders of that, has written a number of books on gay male culture in San Francisco. And it's this one. He talks about gay culture. I only have actually a couple of his books, but Jack Frischter is Jack, Frittscher, and all of his books are readable for free on his website, jackfrischter.com.
Thank you. And I think we have one more question, and that might be the last one for tonight, but a question from Betsy. And this one's for Shad. In your presentation, you showed a slide of the advertisement for the Beaux Arts Ball. Printed on it was tickets sold at Macy's. And Betsy would like to know, how was Macy's involved in the movement?
Well, from what I understand, it was Macy's basement. Well, it was not involved in the movement, but Macy's basement was a huge cruising area. And so that, and that was a cruising area for more middle-class professional men who worked downtown. It wasn't like for just regular people. And I believe that somehow that was connected. They also sold the tickets there. So to my knowledge, it wasn't involved in the movement other than being a cruising site. But believe me, the basement, not the upstairs bathrooms, but the men's bathroom was a huge cruising site, definitely referred to many places.
Gotcha. And actually, Tara had a question too. Did you come across very many references to bisexuality in your research?
Only bisexuality in the sense of people being married while they were, in order to cover for their LGBT, their gay or lesbianism. It was not really something, it was not like bisexuality as that we think of as bisexuality now. It was really putting themselves in a closet.
Gotcha. And then, I wanted to share this really quickly. When you mentioned Lyon and Del Martin, they were recently featured in the Press Democrat because they were inducted to the California Hall of Fame. And there's some pictures there as well of them from 2008, it looks like. Just wanted to make sure that one was there. But I think, do we have any other final questions for tonight?
Not a question, but I did put a link to our blog post in the chat, and I'll put it in there one more time, just in case anyone here was interested in it and wanted to check it out again.
Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah.
All right.
Here we go.
Well, all right. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for tonight. I want to thank you all for making the time to join us tonight. And again, thanks to Tina and Shad for sharing their expertise with all of us about the history of LGBTQ plus people in the Bay Area. We do encourage you to check out that library LGBTQ history post that Stuart just shared. It's at sonomalibrary.org, and it also talks about some of the history of our great local community partners. As a reminder, this event has been recorded and will be available on YouTube in the next few days and will remain viewable for 1 month. All right, thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Have a great evening.